Hey guys, in this video I want to give an overview of the counterculture movements from the late 50s through the 1970s. This isn't going to be specific to like the Vietnam War or Woodstock. I'll probably do longer videos later to cover those topics, but this is a broad view of the big themes of the movement. So the essential question for the counterculture movement is, how is the counterculture movement of the 20th century significant to U.S. history? Consider the beatniks, the hippies, and the anti-war protests. We're going to hopefully answer that question throughout the video. In our I can statement, by the end of this video, you should be able to identify the significant counterculture movements of the 20th century, as well as the reactions and the counter-arguments to those movements. So we're going to stick to the examples of the Beat movement, the hippies, and the Vietnam War protests. So, introduction to this counterculture. After World War II, there was a very large baby boom. The demographics, in short, are that there was a big jump in population because soldiers came home from the war. They had their GI Bill money, they had their zero interest housing loans, they bought their houses, settled down, had a family, and so the population begins to jump in the mid 1940s all the way through 1960. So you have, starting in the 50s and 60s, you have a large cohort of young people, because if you're born in 1944, 1945, 1946, 47, 15 years later, that's 1960. So you're coming out of the womb, and you're going to have a lot of friends that are your age. And there's a big difference between the views of these new baby boomers and their parents, who the parents had experienced either the Great Depression or World War II, or they've seen the Holocaust, they've seen Hitler, they've lived that life where they're going to be more serious people. They're called the greatest generation. The greatest generation is like serving in war. They're not stingy. I would say the word thrifty. They're not really into too much stuff outside of the home. But these new kids, they take liberal positions on things like civil rights, feminism, LGBTQ rights, environmentalism. They begin to listen to new forms of music that their parents did not like. For example, rock and roll, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, all the music where the Beatles, that type of thing, where people are dancing, they're shaking their hips, they're kind of cutting loose a little bit. This new generation is going to have what's called a generation gap with their parents. So the parents will be listening to like jazz and ragtime and that type of music from the early 1900s, where the younger ones are into the rock and roll, the heavy bass and the scene that comes along with that we'll talk about later. The Beat movement is really catalyzed by artists like Allen Ginsberg, Ken Kesey, Neil Cassidy, Jack Kerouac. If you've ever read this art, it's really about like exploration and experimentation, seeing new things, pushing the boundaries, questioning society, those type of underlying values, which is different than like the conformist, nationalistic, patriotic themes that older American authors have had, and that's usually common around war times. Another thing about the Beat writers, they experimented with drugs a lot, so they had different views on lifestyle and like mental fitness, I guess. They believed in like expanding the mind, and Ginsberg and Kerouac in particular were very vocal about their LSD use, which kind of gave them like a divergent personality, different from mainstream. So the rise of the hippie movement in the 1960s. It started with a diverse array of influences from the Beat generation to Eastern philosophy. You see like Ginsberg, Kerouac, a lot of the main voices in this movement emphasize a Buddhist philosophy and the Eastern philosophy as opposed to like strict Christianity. They also have a anti-consumerist mentality, so instead of buying like the latest and greatest product of like how the Roaring 20s, people would take out loans to buy like new vehicles, and in the 40s and 50s you have people buying like the washer, the dryer, the new refrigerator, the house with 2 cars in the driveway and the white picket fence. These hippies, they sort of turn their back on consumerism. They're very anti-nuclear, so after the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, these people, they begin to go against nuclear energy, go against the war, go against consumerism. They buy secondhand clothing. They begin to dress in sort of Native American and tie-dye and colorful clothing instead of the straight-edge businessman with the suit or the dresses that 1950s suburban women would typically wear. The movement gained a lot of attention in 1967 with the so-called Summer of Love, where hundreds of thousands of people gathered around San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury district. The city sort of became a mecca for psychedelic drug use, marijuana, music such as the Grateful Dead, the rock music of the time. Also, there were some of the big artists at this time in that area: Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin. They became like the faces of the movement. Jimi Hendrix, everybody that performed at Woodstock had huge followings of hippie children at that time. And then the philosophy of peace, love, happiness, tuning in, turning on, dropping out, that type of thing, where if the mainstream culture is the Vietnam War and obeying the government and the draft and all that stuff, counterculture to that would be peace, love, and happiness. So it kind of makes us question society, where how bad and how violent do we have to be, where the counterculture is peace and love and the main dominant culture is like war and military industrial complex and violence. So the hippies bring up these points like, hey, why should we serve in a military and go kill people in Asia and around the world when that's not our business? We could just have peace and love and stay here in America and listen to music and relax. So that's sort of the philosophical difference between like the mainstream US versus the counterculture that's developing in the 60s. The backlash. So not everyone is going to be a fan of this counterculture. Some people, especially like law enforcement, the status quo, the people who are more mainstream, they're going to push back against this belief that we can have peace and love and not participate in global affairs and sort of drop out of society. And some flashpoints of the backlash would be, you have the Kent State Massacre in May 4th, 1970, where these students are protesting on the campus of Kent State, and the National Guard comes to break up the protest. Students are accused of throwing rocks at the National Guard, and in response to the students throwing stuff, the National Guard opens fire. They kill 4 students. Actually, they kill I think it's 2 students, and then one person is just a young girl that was walking by that wasn't even actively enrolled in the school. And then 9 others are injured by the shots from the National Guard. It's a really black eye on the National Guard and the mainstream movement of pro-war military-style operations. But it's not so much of a black eye that like the U.S. doesn't do it again. So shortly after, I think it's 10 days after the Kent State Massacre, is the Jackson State Massacre. In this situation, at Jackson State University, a lot of African American students were protesting the law enforcement come to the protest and the dormitory where the protest is taking place. They fire 460 shots at the dormitory. 2 students are killed, 12 are injured. The National Guard and the law enforcement claim that there was a sniper in the dormitory that was firing at them, but it turns out that they did an FBI investigation and no one fired at them. It was just like rocks being thrown. But they fire 460 shots into the dormitory. You have the Hard Hat Riot of 1970, a couple days after Kent State, where these New York City construction workers, they're called hard hats because construction workers, they wear those protective hats. They begin to attack the hippie protesters and injure and beat them. And then a bigger theme against a bigger form of backlash is the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon. This takes LSD, marijuana, mushrooms, MDMA, and it makes them Schedule 1 drugs, and it creates the scheduling of drugs so that if you're in possession of any of these drugs, you can face pretty strict jail time, forfeiture of property, forfeiture of money through fines and stuff like that. So Nixon goes really hard against drugs in 1970, and he actually declares a quote-unquote war on drugs. So not only do we have the Vietnam War going on against the country of Vietnam, but also he creates a war on drugs to kind of go against the hippies and the anti-war protesters who are using a lot of drugs at this time. It gives rights to search and confiscate property and stuff like that. And then also the CIA had, it was called Operation Chaos, and it was an operation where they would surveil and try to sabotage the anti-war movement. So they would target like the young protesters and the hippies and stuff and keep tabs on them, which we're used to the Patriot Act today in today's times, but back then it was a pretty broad reach for the government to be like tapping phones and surveilling students that are American citizens. So those were the backlash, the sort of the backlash incidents that happened because of this movement. But there was also just a general aggression by a mainstream society towards the hippies, because hippies had a very distinct look and behavior, so which made them a target of harassment and criticism. So the decade of the 60s ended in a big way with Woodstock. It was a 4-day music festival in upstate New York where hundreds of thousands of hippies came to do an anti-war music festival. I'm going to play some footage. Hopefully YouTube doesn't block it. But this is an example of the performance of Woodstock. This is Santana. You can see the bongos. Check out the long hair, the sideburns, the outfits they were wearing. This guy. Yeah, pay attention to the crowd, the way the people appear. Most of them haven't had a haircut in weeks or months. Probably unemployable for the most part if they're getting high all the time and going to these music festivals. So that's enough. We don't need to dwell on the whole Woodstock. There's plenty of footage out there if you're curious of Woodstock. And so here's the legacy and the lasting impact when we talk about our essential question of what is the significance of the hippie movement and the counterculture movement. It has a lasting legacy. You can still see today the Grateful Dead is still touring. They have John Mayer now instead of like Jerry Garcia, but they're touring. There's still anti-war protests going on today. There's still rock music going on today. There's still psychedelics going on today. Among young people, you still see that energy out there of not wanting to participate in whatever the dominant war or mainstream movement towards conservatism is. And you still see the government sort of doing the same thing. You still see a war on this mentality of like dropping out and doing drugs and stuff. You see fashion. There's a resurgence of hippie fashion with like the flared out pants, guys having long puffy hair, hippie jewelry, that type of thing. And there's like Coachella, there's all these hippie music festivals that you can go to for 3-4 days, and it's similar to how Woodstock was 50 years ago. So the themes are still there. There's still anti-consumerism, there's environmentalism, peace, love, all that stuff, as well as like we still have the military-industrial complex. We still have weapons being used, like really powerful weapons being used on people across the world. So yeah, all the stuff that was being at the forefront of society in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, it still sort of lingers around today. So that's the legacy of the hippie movement. It's still seen in the protests and the anti-consumerism mindset that exists. So hopefully this was a good overview for you guys, and I'm going to have more as far as like the Vietnam War footage and